We want to welcome you this morning for an exciting opportunity to focus on prevention and wellness. And just to set the stage at an economic conference, it's important to remember that more than 50% of all economic growth in the last 200 years has come from both public health and medical research. Today we are honored to have 5 individuals who at some point and earlier or a little later in their careers all received medical degrees among many other degrees. And if I take you back 20 years where we had a scientific retreat of maybe 200 to 300 of the world's leading scientists, we were attempting to suggest there was some relationship between what went in your body and your health. This is 1993, 1994 in America, and most of them did not accept that thesis. And so after a great deal of negotiation, they agreed to allow someone to speak who was an MD, PhD on nutrition, but only at lunch. Now, we have come a long way since then, and the world has changed. And I think it's symbolic maybe if we started with Peter Attia and his own journey. And Peter was an athlete. He got his MD from Stanford. He was excellent in math, but he began to question some of these issues. And I saw that picture of you, Peter, when you swam in Hawaii, and I was noticing that not only you, but your wife was a little heavy in that picture when we stepped back. Why don't we start there? And why did you follow this path? What caused you to change your career and your focus?
Well, Mike, like you said, I started out with a pretty traditional path. I was a surgical resident at Johns Hopkins, and I think over the years I found myself getting really frustrated, surprisingly.
Just 1 second. Can we maybe call up that slide 29? So we all get comments, from our wives or our significant others constantly. So why don't we just comment about this?
Well, yes. The only reason my wife lets this slide exist is because I point out that she was 6 months pregnant and I was not. But to your question, being a surgeon and dealing with the complications of diabetes, I found it very frustrating. As many of you probably know, once you're amputating the leg or limb of a diabetic patient, the likelihood that they're going to be alive in 5 years is very slim. And so I found it frustrating. I felt like I was putting on Band-Aids all day. And the second, I think, force that kind of got me here is sort of what you've alluded to. This was actually not the nadir of my personal health. It was actually a couple years later. I had just become the maybe 10th person to make the 2-way crossing from Los Angeles to Catalina Island and back. And on that day in September 2009...
not everyone remembers those songs from the 60s. Why don't you let them know how far it is from Los Angeles to Catalina?
Yeah, it's about 25 miles. And so at the end of that swim, my wife said to me something along the lines of, Peter, you're a wonderful swimmer, but you've really got to work on being less, not thin. And even though the initial sort of provoke was towards vanity, it turned out something more sinister was going on. I was actually pre-diabetic. So I was 36 years old, exercising 3 or 4 hours a day, following the food pyramid, as closely as I could, and yet I had this horrible problem. And that really catalyzed me to sort of begin a lot of self-experimentation, a lot of exploration of the literature. And what I came away with was, one, the conventional wisdom obviously didn't apply to me, but perhaps more importantly, I found so much contradictory evidence and inconclusive science in the body of nutrition that I really felt that my calling was to sort of leave what I was doing at the moment and sort of think about a way to make this better. How could we make sure that there was clear and unambiguous insights about diet, the relationship between diet and health, so that everyone could know, full stop, what they needed to eat to be most healthy?
And Peter, I think it'd be interesting, how did your colleagues react to your changes, let's say career changes over the last few years?
You know, it's sort of a mixed bag. I would say, for example, when I left Johns Hopkins, when I left surgery, I think a number of the attending surgeons there felt that I was committing career suicide, that I was leaving the best hospital in the country and a wonderful career behind. And yet there were others that were incredibly supportive. And in fact, one of the most supportive people of all was a guy by the name of Peter Pronovost, who some of you may know. He's an intensivist at Hopkins. And when I told Peter I was leaving, he said, just like Joseph Campbell suggested, right? The hero is the guy with the courage to pursue his bliss. And so whether I'm a hero or a coward, I don't know, but I felt encouraged to pursue my bliss.
Now let's step back. I think we're all aware that we've had some progress in some areas. And I think, Peter, if we go to you, well, let's compare what we did, say, in HIV and AIDS, where we've made significant progress over the past 20 years, with obesity. And as we step back to the Milken Institute, we felt in many ways that the area that we have not succeeded, in spite of enormous effort over the last 20 years. Could you compare and contrast those?
You know, perhaps it's a vestige of being an engineer, but we always love to do pattern recognition and identify simpler cases. And so when you look at that slide 25, the point of this isn't subtle, right? The slide is showing the mortality from AIDS in the United States from the early 1980s until today. And what you see is that the death rate from AIDS rose significantly during the 80s into the mid-90s and then immediately began to plummet as it continues to today. And while we haven't eradicated HIV and AIDS, it's certainly become more of a chronic condition rather than the death sentence it certainly once was. And so, you know, people in this room obviously have contributed to that, and it's remarkable. But the question is why? And so I think there were really two critical things that took place. The first was in the mid-1980s was the correct elucidation of the trigger of AIDS, in this case the HIV virus. So the HIV virus is what weakened the immune system. That's what led to this acquired immune deficiency syndrome. But remember, that alone wasn't enough. In this case, that slowed slightly the incidence, the number of new cases, as we began to at least understand how the virus was transmitted. But it yet wasn't an effective treatment. The effective treatment came in the mid-90s with the introduction of highly active antiretroviral therapy, or HAART therapy. And it was that introduction not only of HAART therapy, but really, to play off what Lynn said, it was the availability of it that enabled this success story to take place. Now, if you look at slide 26, let's contrast that with where we are today with type 2 diabetes. Now, in the latter part of the 17th century, latter part of the 18th century, beginning of the 1900s, you took the largest series that looked at the number of people with diabetes in this country, one out of Massachusetts General Hospital, one out of Johns Hopkins. They pegged the prevalence of diabetes somewhere between 3 and 530 cases per 100,000 Americans. Now, by 1970, that number was up to 2,000 per 100,000 Americans. And today, increasing at a rate of nearly 4%, that number is over 8,000 per 100,000. And I believe Tom already shared with us some data on the cost of that, right? I mean, obesity and diabetes, diabetes and obesity exacerbate these other 4 diseases that we've already talked about: heart disease, stroke, cancer, Alzheimer's disease. And so the total economic cost directly is about $1 billion a day in healthcare spending. When you factor in these indirect costs as well, we're talking about nearly $3 billion a day and 4,000 lives lost. And so the question I always ask myself when I go back to this is I contrast it with the previous slide, and I say, do we have this situation under control? Do we at least understand what the environmental trigger is of diabetes? Now, the conventional wisdom says we do. The answer is people need to eat less and exercise more. But if that's true, why have we been unsuccessful in making progress there? And so if you sort of think about it through the lens of a business, we have sort of a business strategy, and we have a business implementation. And similarly, there may be 2 problems here. Is the problem that our strategy is incorrect, that we have in fact identified the environmental trigger of diabetes and obesity, that it's simply people not being able to control how much they eat or how little they exercise? Or is it that we may have the wrong advice for people? Maybe we're missing something. And so I think of an analogy to put this in perspective. I was speaking with a friend a couple of weeks ago, very smart guy, and he's a pilot. And I was having this discussion with him, and he said, Peter, you're ridiculous. How can you possibly say that we don't understand what causes obesity and diabetes? It's obvious that people just eat too much and don't exercise enough. And I said, maybe, but we've been saying to not do those things for 40 years, and we've put market forces, policies in place to try to curb that, and it hasn't had much effect. And I said, imagine planes were crashing every day and 4,000 people were falling out of the sky dying. Would we say we have a handle on aerodynamics and that it's all under control? I don't think so. I think we'd have a panel just like this where we'd say, well, maybe we don't understand aerodynamics as well as we think they do. And so I think that's what we have today, Mike. I think we have 4,000 people falling out of the sky every day, dying from these diseases that I think we would all agree are entirely preventable. And what I'd like to ask is, do we really have the treatment correct?
I think one of the things we'd like to do is go to each of our panelists today and say what one or two things, very shortly, if we look back a year from now, that could have occurred, that could have dramatically addressed some of these issues. Peter?
You know, I think the thing that I always ask myself is, how do you hedge your bet? So I'd be the first to admit I have sort of an alternative view of things. I'm not convinced we know the answer. We might. Maybe the odds are stacked in the favor that we do, and that it's simply a problem of our failure to implement them, combined with poor willpower and other factors that have all conspired to leave us where we are today, where 2 out of 3 Americans are overweight or obese, and nearly 1 in 10 have diabetes. But what if there's a tiny chance that the problem in some ways stems from the fact that we don't actually know what we know? You know, Mike alluded to the fact that we have more information than ever before. And I think that's true. I call it a signal to noise problem. I'm sure many of you can appreciate that every day there's a new headline. Eat this, don't eat that. This causes cancer. Nope, this causes cancer. Actually, it was this that causes cancer. I think it's time we find out. And I think we actually have the ability to do that. And even if you think the probability is unbelievably slim that the advice we're giving today might actually be incorrect, when you look at the asymmetry of the cost, how can we not justify that hedge? Isn't it worth absolutely knowing for certain what the prescription is before we write it? You know, smoking is a great example, right? When you look at the studies of the 40s and 50s that unambiguously elucidated the trigger between tobacco and emphysema and lung cancer, it's because of that, I would argue, that everything that Tom, Lynn, Dean, everybody has talked about, that's why it's been successful. In fact, if you could just quickly pull up slide 27, you can sort of see the per capita consumption of cigarettes superimposed on the death rate from lung cancer. And the red triangles represent the clear and unambiguous scientific elucidation of that. And the blue and the green triangles illustrate the policy and market responses. And this is what the critical confluence is. You have to have unambiguous scientific elucidation of fact coupled with policy initiatives, market forces, and that's what results in the behavioral shift. This is about creating a non-toxic environment. I completely agree with what Troy said, which is we want to put people in the right default. Nobody's about saying you can't eat this or you should never be allowed to smoke or do X or Y or Z. The point is we don't want that to be the default. I'm just trying to figure out what the default should look like.